You are going to read Druze and Christians and Sunnis and no small number of Shia agonizing and terrified about the war that is coming, that Hezbollah in the service of Iran is bringing. They think war is coming. They don't want to be there. And so that disastrous war, why should Lebanon have to go through it?
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Clarissa Mall, producer and moderator of The Bulletin. In this episode, Mike Cosper and I talk with Times of Israel journalist Haviv Gur about the recent assassination of top Hamas leaders and their implications for the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. Next, Mike and I discuss President Biden's proposed changes to the Supreme Court, Olympic ceremony outrage, and how we can discern what to get angry about. Finally, Michael Weir joins the show to talk about the latest news from the presidential campaign trail. Welcome to the show. This week, news coming out of the Middle East has appeared so rapidly that if you blinked long enough, you might miss a headline. Just last week, Prime Minister Netanyahu was in Washington, D.C. to talk with Congress. And this week, following a Hezbollah strike in the Golan Heights, we have now learned that major Hamas and Hezbollah leaders are dead, including Ismail Haniyeh, perhaps the senior Hamas leader, who was assassinated in Iran on Wednesday. Joining us to slow down the news cycle just a moment and discuss this significant chain of events is Times of Israel journalist Haviv Gur. Haviv, welcome to The Bulletin.
Thank you, Clarissa. Thank you for having me.
Could you take us back to this past weekend and explain what happened in the Golan Heights and how it has catalyzed the events that have followed in the last few days?
For the last 10 months, there has been an unrelenting rocket and missile bombardment of Israel's north by Hezbollah, the Shia group in Lebanon that is deeply intertwined, basically takes orders and funding, and its entire missile arsenal is all Iranian. So it's an Iranian proxy in Lebanon. And last Saturday is the first time that, because tens of thousands, many tens of thousands, almost 100,000 Israelis have fled the north and not gone home in those 10 months, the death toll has been very low on the Israeli side. And that changed on Saturday. On Saturday, a Hezbollah rocket with a roughly 50-kilogram warhead hit a soccer field where an elementary school league game was playing in the Druze town of Majd al-Shams on the Golan Heights. The Druze are a minority in Israel, in Syria, in Lebanon, a religion adjacent to Islam that grew out of Islam, but is very much in the monotheistic traditions, a mystical religion. They are a separate, distinct minority. They're not Jews, they're not Muslims, they're not Shia, they're not Sunni, they're something else. And 12 kids were killed. Almost 30 were wounded, some of them horrifically maimed. In other words, the kill doesn't encapsulate the scale of the suffering, even though it is itself horrible. And Hezbollah put out a statement taking credit for the rocket bombardment. And then when they'd understood what had happened in Majd al-Shams, it had a big problem because there's a large Druze community in Lebanon and in Syria. And even though the Druze in Israel are loyal to Israel, the Druze on the Golan are about half loyal to Syria, half loyal to Israel. They themselves are a community torn by the two claims to the Golan Heights between Israel and Syria. Long story short, all the Druze everywhere, no matter where they stand on the geopolitics, are loyal to each other. And Hezbollah now has created a domestic enemy within Lebanon. And there's already been in Lebanon this tremendous anger at Hezbollah, the sense that it's serving a foreign empire in Iran and it's going to war against Israel to aid Hamas is going to drag Lebanon into a devastating war. So you had this strike, you had this massive death toll for the first time in 10 months, and you had Hezbollah shortly after claiming it was them, then claiming when they understood what had happened that it wasn't. Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, yesterday gave a speech in which he said it was an Israeli Iron Dome interceptor that fell short in Majd al-Shams. There have been very, very rare, one in many thousands of interceptors falls short. They are programmed to detonate if they miss. But also the main reason we know that that's not true is that the Tamir interceptor, it has a 9-kilogram warhead, which simply could not have caused the damage. It's not even a debate. There's no serious person thinks it isn't Hezbollah. Israel responded in the Beirut neighborhood of Dahiya, which is a Hezbollah headquarters and stronghold. It hit a building where the senior commander of its military forces was hiding. He was killed, and 10 hours later, the most senior head of Hamas in the Hamas hierarchy, Ismail Haniyeh, was killed, and he was killed in a safe apartment in the heart of Tehran, where he was the guest of the supreme leader for the installation of the new prime minister. And so that's where we stand. We are now preparing. Nasrallah said that there's going to be a terrible, terrible retaliation. He actually said a line in his speech, the Israelis are happy now and they will be weeping soon. And the Iranians are looking for a way to respond to the humiliation of the Haniyeh assassination. The Hezbollah military chief that was killed was also their number one missile expert and was actually a very important piece of that whole military system.
So where is Iran in this conflict now? Do you think that the events of this last week have finally sparked the tinderbox of a greater Middle East conflict?
Basically, we have two conflicts. It looks like we have 11, okay? It looks like we have a conflict with Iran and Syria and Yemen, and the Houthis, for some reason, have been shooting. And it looks like all these different conflicts. But in fact, there are two. There's the conflict with the Palestinians, where there's Hamas in Gaza, and there's the terrible toll it's taken on Gaza on October 7 and the massacre of Israeli Jews, and all the complexity there of an occupation in the West Bank. And Palestinians don't vote for the Israeli military governor who runs the West Bank, and so there's also a moral debt there that Israel owes the Palestinians, while Hamas does need, according to most Israelis, to be destroyed in Gaza. All of that infinite complexity and problems and all of the thing that is, we're just going to call it for the purposes of using words, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's one front. And the second is Iran. Iran desperately wants to destroy Israel, but not because it cares about Palestinians. Iran does not worry about Palestinian rights. It does not worry about Iranian rights. It is not a democracy. It is not liberal. Iran is fighting, in its vision of itself, a war to redeem Islam from hundreds and hundreds of years of weakness. And the best and first important victory available to Muslims that Muslims must go through to do that is destroying the Jewish state, because the Jewish state, in the Iranian understanding of things, is the weakest enemy that ever pushed Islam back. And so it's the first one that must be destroyed in Islam's path back. Iran activates the Houthis of Yemen. Iran funds them, arms them, trains them. The militias in Syria, the Shia groups in Iraq who attack American soldiers, who fire occasionally rockets at Kurds or at Israelis, are Iranian-led, Iranian-run, and Hezbollah wouldn't exist without Iran. Its entire budget, its entire strategy, its training, it takes literal orders from the Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran. For example, 10 months ago, when Hezbollah was starting to fire rockets at Israel over the Gaza war, Iran told it, don't go to war. Don't have a full-fledged war. Why? Your job is to continue to exist when Israel and Iran have a full-fledged war. You're a second front to protect us. So you're not allowed to destroy yourself. So don't escalate. And that's the kind of war we saw in the north, this very low-level bombardment, constant bombardment. So that's the second war. The second war is Iran, and Iran is all of it. Now, this is a really important point for people in the West to understand. On its path to, as it sees it, this revolutionary regime in Iran, redeem Islam and therefore redeem the world, it is destroying nations. Now, it wants to destroy my nation, but it's finding it difficult. It is not finding it difficult to destroy Yemen. It is not finding it difficult to destroy Syria. The Assad regime would have fallen in a year, and there would not have been 600,000-700,000 dead and millions disappeared, lost, fled in Syria without Iran stepping into that war. And I mean that specifically. This is a podcast with Christianity Today. I have to tell you, people should Google this. They should not believe an Israeli Jew on this. Syria in 2011 was 10% Christian, and this is one of the oldest Christian communities on earth. And Syria today is less than 2% Christian. The vast majority of that community is gone. And that is Iran. And that is Iran everywhere in the Middle East. It also would like to destroy us.
Haviv, I'd love to hear you talk about strategically the fact that Hania was targeted in Tehran. Was that a target of opportunity? It seems like it would have been as intended to send a message as it would anything else. And does that message stay Iran's hand, or does it aggravate Iran to say, this is such an insult, this is such a slap in the face, this is such an embarrassment, we have to strike even harder on the way back?
Iran is now engaged in a strategy that the best way I think to think about it is the death of 1,000 cuts. Standing Arab armies invading Israel failed. They tried multiple times. It failed disastrously. Decades of anti-colonial style, Algerian independence war or Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya or Viet Cong style harassing and guerrilla and terrorism failed. And so now Iran has built out a strategy it called uniting the fronts, where Israel is constantly pummeled at a low level from all sides by militias that are willing to destroy their own societies. And so Israel has very little leverage over them. What can Israel do to Hamas if Hamas is not just willing? Ismail Haniyeh said publicly, the dead women and dead children, this is a quote of his, people should look it up, are the stepping stone on which Palestine will be redeemed, and also in his vision, Islam ultimately. And so the mass destruction of Lebanon doesn't deter Hezbollah. The mass destruction of Gaza doesn't deter Hamas. And so the strategy is deny the Israelis the ability to deter us by being willing ourselves to destroy our own societies. The bitter joke in the Arab Middle East today is that Iran, which is not Arab, it's Persian, is willing to fight Israel to the last Arab. Iran isn't paying the cost. But that's the strategy, the death of 1,000 cuts. I would put it very simply. Over the last 10 months, that strategy has reached a tipping point. Iran says publicly, we're going to destroy you. And over the last 10 months, it convinced the Israelis that we have nothing to lose. And so it has lost its ability to deter us. What is Iran going to do now? Launch 350 missiles? It's already done that. What is it going to do now? Bombard entire sections of Israel that have to empty of their populations and slowly be demolished over months and months and months? What's it going to do? Threaten to take mass numbers of hostages? And so because it has already informed us that this ends with our destruction, we're going to have this shootout now, because what have I got to lose? So Iran's strategy is backfiring. The Yemen shot 220 missiles at Israel over the last 10 months, the Houthis of Yemen. And one drone made it through the Israeli missile defense, apparently human error, but okay, maybe not. Maybe the 221st just literally made it through. That's fine. That's not a bad shoot down rate. It killed an Israeli. And the Israeli response was to set the entire oil port of Hodeidah, which is the Houthis' main source of income for that government, on fire. And that was a response not to the one missile that killed one Israeli, but to 220. And that's basically what happened with Haniyeh and with Iran. Iran has set the north of Israel on fire by its direct order. So we're going to do everything we can to humiliate and hurt it. And what's it going to do? Set Israel on fire? It's already going to do that. And so we are free. And that's what Iran is now feeling and seeing. It's reaping the whirlwind of convincing us we have nothing left to lose.
What do these assassinations, what does this current sort of round of escalation mean for Gaza? What does it mean for the hostage deal?
At the narrow level, the hostage deal is definitely delayed. The families of the hostages are very frustrated and scared. A lot of them, not all of them. There are many voices, but a lot of them are very scared. A lot of Israelis believe that we need to make that hostage deal fast. We need to make it now. That's our fundamental imperative. That's our ethos as Israelis. We are Jews who protect each other after the 20th century. That's when we stopped dying, was when we started protecting each other. And so that's who we are, and that's the priority, even at the cost of Hamas remaining in power. When you talk to anti-government protesters demanding the government sign a deal now, even at the cost of Hamas surviving the war, they say to you, look, if Sinwar, the head of Hamas in Gaza, survives in Gaza, that's not good for Israel. It's not good for Israeli deterrence. But it's catastrophic for Gaza. It means you can't rebuild Gaza. If Hamas is in charge of Gaza, nobody knows how to rebuild. America's going to come in with billions of dollars. Germany's going to want to build with billions. The Emiratis, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks, everybody's going to want to come in and build. But Hamas is in charge, so nobody's going to be able to. We're not helping Gazans by ending this war. We're not helping Gazans by helping Hamas. I've actually talked to families asking for a ceasefire who feel that they are hurting Palestinians by asking for this ceasefire, but it's getting their family members out of this hostage situation. I belong to the other side of this debate in Israel, and I think that Hamas releases hostages only when they have no choice. They're up against a wall. They're about to die. It's the only way to save themselves in the immediate term. And we, for months and months and months, largely as a function of American pressure, but not only, also as a function of internal Israeli politics, have not pressured Hamas in that way. And so I think that the immediate short term, this pushes a deal away. If we can sustain massive pressure, terrify to their very toes the leadership of Hamas to survive, they will give us hostages. That is my view. And I hope that bears out. In the medium term, I think this is a good thing. In the short term, it's a bad thing for getting our hostages back.
Peace feels like such a flimsy word right now, but I want to ask it anyways. Can we still hope for it in this region? And what do you think after the events of this week it will take to actually achieve?
When you look at the source of the conflict, particularly when it comes to Gaza, most of the obstacles start to move out of the way once Hamas is defeated. You're worried about food in Gaza? Defeat Hamas. You want the hostages to come home? Defeat Hamas. You want a future. You want an economic future. You want opportunities. You want some other ruling authority to come in. There's sort of these dreams that have been laid out about, what if some third party came in and took over and you'd have Singapore on the Mediterranean and all of that. None of that happens until Hamas is defeated and out of the way. Part of where we come back to in this conversation, where we've been coming back to in this conversation for 10 months is war is horrible. It's a horrible thing to watch. It's a horrible thing to consume on social media. And the ways in which people have consumed media and ideas about this war have created the sense that the most important thing to do is to stop the fighting, rather than, to put it very, very primitively and generically, defeat the bad guys to end the war. If you want a lasting peace, the first thing that has to happen is you have to finish the work of disempowering and defenestrating a terrorist organization who has said, our goal is dead Israelis and as many dead Palestinians as are necessary to get to that goal. We will continue to do that. And we will divert every resource, every bit of aid, every bit of support, every foreign investment will be diverted to those ends.
Haviv, what is one very practical, strategic step that you hope that Israel takes in the next week?
It's not a single step. It's a basket of steps, but they all go in the same direction. I hope it goes at Iran. If you follow the social media in Lebanon over the last 10 months, it'll break your heart, because you are going to read Druze and Christians and Sunnis and no small number of Shia agonizing and terrified about the war that is coming, that Hezbollah in the service of Iran is bringing. And why should that be? Hezbollah has 150,000 missiles in Lebanon, and they're buried under 200 villages. And we talked about the 80, 90, maybe 100,000 Israelis who fled the north over the last 10 months. 100,000 Lebanese villagers fled southern Lebanon over the last 10 months as well. They think war is coming. They don't want to be there. They know Hezbollah will use them as human shields. All those missiles are buried under their villages. Israel will have to go after those missile silos so that 150,000 missiles don't land in Tel Aviv and set us on fire. I mean, literally set cities on fire. And so that disastrous war, why should Lebanon have to go through it? It's in the service of Iran. On April 13, because Israel killed the Iranian general in charge of Syria and Lebanon, in other words, the man coordinating and arming and strategizing the bombardment of Israel's north for months and months. In early April, Israel killed him in Damascus. And Iran's response was the single biggest missile attack in the history of missiles. Something like 350 missiles and drones were launched at Israel. And almost all of them got shot down, including by Sunni Arab allies of Israel, publicly shooting them down. That was an astonishing moment. I was very happy about that event because Iran was shooting from Iranian soil. The focus was on Iran. Let the cost be borne by Iran. Let America exact vast costs from Iran. No boots on the ground. Don't make the mistakes in the Middle East that America's made in the past. I'm not saying you should. I'm not saying you're going to, even if I beg you to. And I'm not going to beg you to because you shouldn't. But why is Iran still able to export oil when it drove the genocides in Yemen? And you care about hungry children. You care about dying children. Gaza is a terrible, terrible war. We have to talk about the humanitarian death don't in Gaza. I never tell people don't talk about that. We must. If a New York Times reporter starts out a little anti-Israel because there's dead kids in Gaza, I think that's just journalism. I then wish they would be a little more curious and actually ask what's happening, what people think is happening to them, etc. But Yemen was a disaster 10 times larger. And Syria was a disaster 25 times larger. And it never registered in the Western mind. And so Iran, people are dying for Iran. Iran is orchestrating wars and disasters and catastrophes in the Middle East, and nobody is making it pay a cost. Let's take out its capacity to export oil. Huge parts of the Iranian economy, especially energy, are controlled not by the Iranian government and not by the Iranian state, but by something called the Revolutionary Guard Corps, which serves directly the supreme leader. It's a separate army from the Iranian army that answers to the Iranian government. And it basically owns or runs or certainly mainly profits off of the Iranian energy industry. Let's take out the Iranian energy industry. Why should they be allowed to have an energy industry? That's a blow to China. That's a blow to Russia. That is not in America's interest. So all the next Israeli steps have to be costs from Iran.
Well, certainly it's a lot to take in. And Haviv, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your help in that regard. Listeners, if you're interested in more of our coverage on the Israel-Hamas war, we commend to you our limited series podcast, Promised Land, hosted by our own Mike Cosper. You'll find the link in our show notes. We will be right back. Every week, our team here at the Bulletin combs through countless headlines to determine what we'll talk about on the show. One of the filters for us is always, is this real news or is this just spectacle? Is a particular news story bling and hype, or is it substantive enough for extended analysis and conversation? 2 stories popped up in our news feeds that gave us pause for precisely those questions this week. First, President Biden's speech on Supreme Court changes, and second, the opening ceremony of the Olympics in Paris. This week, in a speech at the LBJ Presidential Library in Texas, President Biden outlined changes to the Supreme Court that he said were intended to combat rising extremism within America's justice system. His proposal included creating term limits and an enforceable ethics code for justices, as well as developing a constitutional amendment that would limit presidential immunity. So, Mike, from your seat on the bus, were President Biden's proposed changes for the Supreme Court noteworthy or inconsequential?
I think they're noteworthy in the sense that it tells us something about our politics. To actually achieve some of the things that he's proposing, I mean, there's some debate about how you could get this done. First of all, you'd have to have significant legislative success, which is extremely rare these days on bipartisan basis. It's even more rare when it comes to something like a constitutional amendment, which with certain aspects of what he's proposing in terms of the term limits and things like that, a number of scholars have looked at this and said the only way to get this actually done is with a constitutional amendment. It's real in the sense that I think he's addressing an anxiety inside the Democratic Party that's very, very real. They're very upset about the rulings that the court has laid down over the last few years because they feel like there are rights and freedoms being taken away from them, that the court is saying this is the responsibility of the legislature to take care of, not the court. The court doesn't protect these things if the legislature hasn't written laws about them. There's aspects of what Biden's proposing, a code of ethics, things like that are fairly reasonable. It would be ironic if you enforced a code of ethics on the Supreme Court that was not also required of members of Congress and sitting presidents. So if you're going to impose that on the court, great. But the idea that this is something that we need for the court and nowhere else because the court is particularly corrupted and distorted just doesn't reflect the reality right now.
It's unlikely that these changes will succeed, and so it seems like it's pretty clear this is political posturing. Is this a conversation that perhaps would be more fruitful in a setting that had less political heat than ours does now? Like, could we have this same conversation 4 years from now with a very different outcome?
The fundamental problem with the solutions that are being proposed, it's reflective of the problem that we see in so much of our politics. We want it fixed now. We're one election away from getting it fixed. So vote for Kamala Harris and vote for all the Democrats and get them in there, and they're going to wave the magic wand in February and make all of your judicial problems go away. The thing is that they're actually not going to make all those problems go away because after the Dobbs ruling, The issue of abortion, for instance, is sent to legislatures. And that means federal legislatures can deal with it, state legislatures can deal with it. That was what the ruling was about. It was not about, is abortion legal in the United States? It was, who gets to decide? And what the court said is, you got to write a law. You want something to be protected? Make a law for it. And that's what you hear over and over again. I just think this kind of reactionary approach, what it does is it politicizes the court in a way that the court is not meant to be politicized. The whole point of lifetime appointments is you put people on there and they're not swayed by the next election. Biden's idea of adding justices every other term or whatever the deal is, that turns every single election into a swing election for the court. That's a very dangerous game to play with the judiciary.
While President Biden's Supreme Court proposal appears to score high on the hype scale, it may be eclipsed by the outrage that's been expressed around the opening ceremonies of the Paris Olympics that began last week. Can you just describe for listeners what happened at the opening ceremony and tell us, is the outrage about it legitimate?
The scene that got everyone's attention, the opening shot, was framed up in a way that made almost every viewer immediately think of The Last Supper. Basically, the whole setting around the table were drag queens and people dressed and dancing and contorting in ways that were very sexualized. Immediately, a number of Christians reacted and said, this is like a desecration of the Last Supper. My sense of this is, if you wouldn't do it to Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, right? If you wouldn't do a send-up that was directly confrontational to the sort of core ideas and values of other people's religions, don't do it to Christianity. It's just respectful. It's neighborliness, right? That's at the foundation, I would say that. And that was my reaction as well. Some people, of course, got much more upset. They were calling for boycotts. Among progressive Christians, there was kind of this reaction where a lot of people were saying something along the lines of, look, the church has offended lots of people and wounded lots of people over the years. You kind of had this coming. You also had this reaction from people who were on the side of the Olympics. You had some Olympic officials saying, no, it wasn't the Last Supper. It was the feast of Dionysus. I think it's a fairly settled fact, even though there's still denial as to what was happening from some of the organizers. They knew what they were doing. The performers, when they posted about it online afterwards, referenced the Last Supper. They referenced the Holy Family. There was a whole acknowledgement that it was the Last Supper before there was a denial that it was the Last Supper. And there's some things that are very, very disturbing in the imagery. It's very intentionally about that contrast between Carnival and the Eucharist. But it ends in the deconstruction of the Feast of the Eucharist and kind of the triumph of Dionysus, the triumph of chaos. It should disturb us. And that doesn't mean boycott the Olympics, but it also doesn't mean just dismiss it.
Should we expect the secular world to treat our religious symbols better? Or are we frustrated and angered because underlying this imagery is something that is deeply political in American culture right now?
I think it is reasonable to lament and to speak up and say, hey, maybe next time leave our symbols out of it. This is the opening ceremony of the Olympics. They knew 1 billion people were going to be watching. That includes the right-wing reactionary online trolls in America, but it also includes Syrian Christians, Nigerian Christians, Indian Christians, Chinese Christians, people whose faith is continually being tested, people who are being persecuted for their faith in Jesus Christ. The idea that we would say, well, because we don't like these right-wing reactionaries, that's a very myopic way to think about the church. It's a very myopic way to think about culture. I think there's a difference between seeing it as an opportunity for outrage and seeing it as an opportunity for lament. I think there's a difference between using it as a call to arms for activism and everything else and doing what the Bishop of Malta did, which was to write a letter that just said, look, this was disrespectful to Christians around the globe. Just next time, leave Jesus out of it. I think that's a low bar to ask for as the church, as part of our public witness. I also think we shouldn't be surprised when it happens again and when we're ignored again. But the difference is Christians didn't have to go looking to be offended. We were invited as global citizens to be part of this big celebration. And this big celebration included something that was pretty blasphemous to our faith. How we form our spiritual imaginations is really, really important. How are we shaping the moral outlook on the world that is the intuitive, reactive part of us. One of the things I do think it calls for the Christian to think about, how are we shaping our spiritual imaginations? What's being done to shape our spiritual imaginations? The core of that for most of Christian history was gathering with the church and worshiping with the church and being immersed in the story of the gospel in a vivid and beautiful way. One of the reasons why I think it's worth having a little bit of outrage for this, or a little bit of lament, or whatever phrase, is what's the core of that gathering? What's the core of that shaping practice of the spiritual imagination? The Eucharist, the Lord's table, the Last Supper. If our spiritual and moral imaginations are shaped by the story of the gospel, I do think it makes us less reactive. I do think it gives us that long view. One of my favorite reactions to all of this was something to the effect of, oh, this is this horrible desecration of the name of Jesus. And somebody said, Jesus' humiliation doesn't get lower than the cross. You can't hurt the reputation of Jesus when he lowered himself to a depth that no man has ever had to before or since. And so I think there is something beautiful in that helps us to not overreact when these kinds of things happen. At the same time, I think it ought to also, while it tempers our reactivity, it should also sensitize us to messages that are meant to sort of deconstruct and degrade the story that is told when we gather week by week.
Listeners, we've found this to be a helpful lens as we scan the news, and we hope you'll find it helpful too. The next time you read a headline, ask yourself the question, is this worth getting my dander up? If so, take a few deep breaths, read deeply, especially with those with whom you disagree, and offer your anger to the Lord for his chastening as you determine how to act. And if the headlines aren't worth an elevated blood pressure, work to let them go and redirect your attention to the things that make for peace. As Frederick Buechner said, let go of the dark, which you wrap yourself in like a straitjacket, and let in the light. We will be right back. We're less than a month away from the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and American politics continues to leave us shaking our heads in bewilderment and surprise. There seems to always be something new around the bend. Just 2 weeks ago, J.D. Vance became the darling of the Republican Party when former President Donald Trump chose him as his vice presidential running mate, but that love appears to be fading pretty fast. Meanwhile, in the last week, Mr. Trump has both encouraged Christians with the claim that voting will be unnecessary after his next term as president, and alienated Black voters with disparaging comments about his opponent Kamala Harris's racial identity. Joining us to sort it all out is our good friend Michael Ware, founder, president, and CEO of the Center for Christianity and Public Life. Michael, welcome back to the show.
So good to be with you.
As you survey the last week of politics in American life, what stands out to you most right now?
I think it's been a stunning rollout for the vice president in her campaign for the Democratic nomination. So I think there's something to talk about there. I will say, as I've seen J.D. Vance's rollout take place, it seems really apparent to me that he's getting squeezed by obviously left and a Democratic Party that understands that Republican voters' relationship with him is not as developed as their relationship with Trump, and sees a real opportunity to frame him in a way that they really can't change too many people's opinions about the head of the Republican ticket. But he's also getting squeezed on the right. I know a lot of work has gone into framing J.D. Vance as just another Republican and all this, but anyone who knows J.D. Vance's role in the Republican Party over the last several years knows that he has been pressing the party, particularly on economics and questioning sort of traditional Reaganomics approach. And so you get the sense that the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal isn't necessarily thrilled that he was picked as well. And so he's not getting the cover from traditional Republican establishments, from Fox News, from some of these influential Republican voices that other running mates would have. It's kind of a reverse Paul Ryan situation. In 2012, Mitt Romney picked Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan, I think, played a significant role in weakening that ticket. Now, Paul Ryan was well within the mainstream of Republican economics, but sort of got framed up in a way that he didn't get quite the cover in the other direction. J.D. Vance is facing the fact that this is sometimes what a rebel gets you in politics, which is maybe you could rise to the top, but once you get there, you don't have a lot of friends.
Certainly, economics is one area where he's starting to feel that squeeze. And cost for Project 2025, that's another area for J.D. Vance where he's starting to, I don't know, seem like a man without a country.
He has written the foreword. So Kevin Roberts has a book coming that is about Project 2025, and it's the vision for, the Heritage Foundation is this conservative think tank. They've been around forever. They've been advising the Republicans on policy for a very long time. So they've had this role, and in the Trump years, they have become probably the leading establishment think tank of Trumpism. And so they began this initiative that was basically like, here's all the things that the Trump administration should do to fulfill his Trumpy vision of the future for Washington, D.C. And some of it's kind of draconian. Some of it's kind of scary, particularly to people on the left. But what's just amazing about it is that you had this campaign from left-wing activists and politicians and some in the media to say, hey, look out for Donald Trump. Project 2025 will show you exactly where he's going. It's very scary. This is his big thing. And then Trump just goes, I don't know these people. I don't know anything about Project 2025. They're as crazy as the left.
Why is he doing that?
Because he wants to win. Because he'll do anything to win. What makes him unique as a political figure is he is utterly incapable of shame. So what that means is it means that where a lot of politicians have to figure out, like this is something you're seeing with Kamala Harris right now, Kamala Harris is trying to figure out, how do I reposition myself from some of the positions I took in 2019 and 2020 that were pretty out there on the left? And in the old days of like the normal political world, we would have said, oh, she's flip-flopping or whatever. But in some ways, that's kind of the normal thing that would happen. You would run to the far left in the primaries, and then you'd sort of move to the center. She's skipping the primary, so she's going to the center, and she's abandoning a bunch of old commitments. With Trump, though, it doesn't work that way. Trump's finger is constantly in the wind. He has a better sense of where the mob is than any other politician that we've ever seen in our lifetime. And he's not afraid to turn on a dime. So he can run as a pro-life candidate, the most pro-life candidate in the history of, blah, 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 as he likes to say. And then in 2024, rip the pro-life plank out of the Republican platform. And he feels no shame about it. He feels no guilt about it, because for him, the goal of politics is not to achieve policy goals. It's just to win.
The media is pulling out all of this old footage of J.D. Vance calling Kamala Harris a childless cat lady, and footage that seems to imply that J.D. Vance believes that a woman should stay at home with her children and not work. He talks a lot about being a one-income family. Old footage has resurfaced that shows he has supported a 15-week abortion ban. All of these things that it would appear Donald Trump cares very little to nothing about. Are these issues where Republicans will just need to agree to disagree? Or when it comes down to it, is Donald Trump going to have to make a different decision about who runs with him if he's going to win in November?
I don't know if that's possible. The convention has taken place. The nomination of J.D. Vance has been made official. And I don't even know what the process would be to roll that back, or if there's precedent for that. This is not an uncommon problem, and Trump has the personality and sort of the profile to say, J.D. Vance is my running mate. He'll do what I say, and I'm the one in charge. He said recently at an event something like, the pick of a running mate has never mattered before. And, it's just such a replay of Donald Trump just completely eviscerating anyone who decides to be by his side. So I think that that'll be Donald Trump's play. He'll tell people, you're not electing J.D. Vance, you're electing me.
Do you think Christians are okay with that positioning?
Christians who have supported Trump have shown a tremendous ability to trust Trump and what he says. I also think Vance, he's not as bad in terms of a political talent as what the last week and a half have suggested. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a turn here and Vance doesn't end up being the sort of pure negative that he has been for the last week and a half. I do think it's viable for Trump to say, I'm leading this ticket, this is my party, and everyone's falling in line behind me.
At the end of the day, the biggest force of gravity in the Republican Party is Donald Trump, and that force is going to win. Now, what we've seen since the emergence of Donald Trump in 2016 is that J.D. Vance has utterly attuned all of his ideological convictions to align with Donald Trump and has had no problem doing that thus far. I don't know why we won't see that sort of whatever that looks like in this moment from here forward. That said, it's 2024. Like, if we've learned anything from the first half of this year, we ought to know that literally anything can happen this year, it seems like. And so, Michael said this a moment ago, that the mechanisms to remove Vance from the ballot would be very, very difficult. However, it's Donald Trump. Anything can happen. That's not to say that the rules don't matter and the process doesn't matter, but you have a party that's really built around the will of one man in a way that we haven't ever seen before. And so I think their capacity to make that shift, if it was ever going to happen in our lifetime, let's just put it that way. If it was ever going to happen in our lifetime, this is the season where we would see it.
Another thing that we don't know yet is who Kamala Harris will choose as her running mate, right? So how do you anticipate this choice affecting J.D. Vance in particular, because they may go head-to-head in a debate?
Will it make Trump feel like Vance is really failing him if this rollout of Harris's running mate goes really well? And there's a lot of media buzz, and I expect that there will be. Obviously, the vice presidential debate is really the signature responsibility of the running mates. And again, I think Vance is a really interesting figure who will surprise people on the debate stage. It is going to be the same Democratic playbook against Republicans doesn't quite work against Vance. So that moment, if he delivers in that moment, all else will be forgiven. Now, what's interesting about Harris is the vice president's campaign has the ability to create an extended honeymoon period here. I'd argue they're still on it. The running mate's going to roll out at the latest on Tuesday. There's going to be a rally in Philadelphia on Tuesday. It's possible, even likely, it leaks out before then. And then they roll right into the convention. And so this is potentially the benefit of such a late entrance, which is, as we talked about before, there are all kinds of issues with Harris. She has a record of taking pretty left-wing positions. The question is whether anyone's going to have time to dig into it and press her on it before she's elected, which raises a whole range of other questions about Democratic accountability and all these things. But just looking at the campaign, she might have a third of this campaign over before she really has to deal with the kind of pressure we're used to seeing presidential candidates face.
One of the advantages that she has is that she's played a background role in these Biden years. And she's had some bad press in the Biden years. She's had some turnover. She's had all of these things. I think from what we're seeing from the success of the rollout is that she's learned a lot of lessons during this time. And she's managed this rollout pretty well thus far. Because she's played that role for the last 4 years, I actually think it puts her in a position to very smartly be able to say, look, I've been part of the Biden administration and I was against fracking in 2020, and here are the things that we've done, and fracking is safer than ever and better than ever, so drill, baby, drill. I think she can make those kinds of pivots, and we've already seen her start to do some of that would be strategically intelligent for her. The challenge is that those pivots won't be as exciting for that far left flank. And, it's just a question of whether or not she's willing to tune out the activist flank online and play to the middle, play to the electorate, play to the swing voter. If the campaign is able to do that over the next 3 or 4 months, I think anything can happen for her.
The Hill reported this week that Pennsylvania's Governor Josh Shapiro is facing growing pushback from progressives even as his stock rises in the Harris Veep stakes conversation. What do you think Kamala needs in a vice president to really secure the confidence of her whole party and then subsequently the nation?
I don't think they help themselves in any way by allowing the early narrative to be, of course, it's going to be a white male. So you saw them push back and actually roll out a bigger slate of candidates that included non-white males. But the early laser focus on a very narrow political calculation around the running mate, I don't think helped the campaign with anyone. I think they've slightly adjusted for that. It's an interesting choice. Democrats, in some ways, will be willing to concede quite a bit because of the interest of defeating Trump. And Harris's capital is so high right now, she's going to be introducing this running mate from a position of strength. I kind of think the pushback against Shapiro is pretty limited. I don't think that there's a firestorm of criticism against Shapiro. I think you have some activist groups who, sure, would prefer Walz, who's advanced maybe the biggest chain of progressive legislative successes in the state of Minnesota that we've seen in decades. I think there's a lot of interest on the left to concretize and validate those victories. And so I expect all this internal stuff. It's all about influencing it before the decision. I think once the decision is made, you'll probably see a Democratic Party that's relatively unified.
Walz is an interesting name that gets thrown into the mix, because if you just hear Walz, if you hear him speak or see his appearances online, he sort of codes in terms of his personality and everything as pretty conservative. I'm not convinced she would walk away from that, because I think the media would be very friendly to her spinning the progressive stuff in a way that smoothed out the rough edges of it. One of the things that does bother me in this whole Veep stakes of the moment is I think it's unfortunate that you've got a candidate like Shapiro where people are sort of saying the quiet part out loud and saying, well, the real problem with Shapiro is that he's Jewish and he's too pro-Israel as a result. The lowest form of punditry on the planet is, what if the Republicans did that? But let's just imagine for a moment that Donald Trump was doing a Veep stakes and one of the candidates that was, on the top of the list was Jewish, and they were saying, well, he's got that problem on the alt-right. He probably shouldn't pick the Jewish guy. The media would be going nuts. People would be going crazy. We can't do our politics that way. Of course, policy on Israel is fair game for discussion and all of that. The way you see that issue and the way you see him discussed around that issue is really unfortunate. And if they're not careful, will come back to bite them in the long term.
I do think Senator Mark Kelly is going to get real consideration. I do think he has significant upside. I know there's a lot of attention for good reason. The Great Lakes, Blue Wall, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. But he is from one of the major battleground states. There are some complications around. If he was the candidate, they'd need to run a special election in Arizona and potentially lose his seat in the Senate. Former astronaut, he knows how to be strong while also being second to a powerful woman. His wife was a congresswoman. That's how he got his rise. I think that he'd be an interesting selection. I do think for media presence, for the raw political talent that he is, Mayor Pete Buttigieg is someone who I think is still going to be favored by a lot of people, particularly sort of political operative types who see a lot of potential there. And then finally, this is a name that hasn't been discussed. I don't buy that it has to be a white male. I don't buy that it has to be a male. And Amy Klobuchar, I think, could do more for the ticket when you look at the blue wall than a lot of the other people under discussion, because one time they lived in the state or this or that. And so I don't think it's going to be her, but I kind of want to be on the record in case it is, so I could say, look at me.
What voices do you think should speak loudest in the Christian's ear right now as he or she is looking at this political landscape?
It is not about finding the one voice you trust. It's about finding voices that you respect in different locations with different focuses, and not overwhelming yourself with information, but getting enough of a sample that you can construct a sort of healthy vision of what's actually happening. So that would be another sort of point of guidance, which is don't allow yourself to get siloed off into just one narrow narrative about how this election is playing out, but try and find voices in different social and political locations that can give you a more holistic view of what's actually happening in this race and in this country.
We've got 100 days until Election Day, and we need to use them wisely. Listeners, if you enjoy what you've heard, be sure to rate and review us in your podcast app. Better yet, tell your friends about us. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you next week. The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Clarissa Mall. The associate producer is Leslie Thompson. This episode was mixed by TJ Hester, theme music by Dan Phelps. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.